Now, you've had 9 science fiction books, and then at age 42, something dramatic happens in your life. You decide to abandon atheism. You convert to Christianity. Why?
Well, my conversion happened in 2 parts. There was a natural part and there was a supernatural part. The natural part was that as I got older and was a married man and had children, I began to realize that atheism was not a philosophy, was not a sufficient groundwork for dealing with the real world I had to deal with. It did not answer certain questions I had. It did not seem to form a coherent basis for a moral philosophy, especially for a philosophy that allows you to raise children correctly. And so I read more and more into certain Christian apologists like C.S. Lewis, and particularly G.K. Chesterton, who I hope you've heard of. He's a famous writer from the last century. And these men seemed so witty and wise and solidly grounded in the important things in life. And my fellow atheists seemed so flippant. I don't know a better word for it. Their answers to life's deep questions seemed quite superficial to me. I began to find myself slowly finding that my fellow atheists, I was the only member of my camp, and I marched under the atheist banner, and I wore the uniform, and I did everything else an atheist was supposed to do, weren't thinking like me. They weren't agreeing with me on any of the basic questions. And so on every single question, but the question of whether God existed, I was agreeing with the enemy. I was agreeing with the Christians about things like abortion and infidelity and adultery and homosexuality and other questions of what I'm going to teach my kids is right and wrong. And so as my hatred of Christianity began to erode, I began to look into it more and more, trying to figure out why my hated enemies, the Christians, happened to be right on so many issues when they were wrong on the basic issue of where the universe came from and who made it. And then I decided on an experiment. I was reading Aquinas's Summa Theologica, and I realized that if the only way to find out whether God existed was to read this huge, complex philosophical work and go through every step of the reasoning and find out if the deductions were true or false, that was a method that no real person could use. No peasant in a field can find out.
What you attempt then is an experiment in prayer, right?
Because I realized you couldn't philosophically deduce yourself to God, because God wouldn't set up a system that was so difficult to achieve knowledge of Him, I decided to experiment and pray. And so what I said is, Dear God, I know you don't exist. I know philosophically, and I know with as much certainty as a man who knows twice 2 is 4, that you cannot possibly exist. But if I'm wrong, because as a philosopher you have to recognize you might be mistaken about your conclusions, but if I'm wrong, I dare you, I challenge you to show yourself to me. I demand it, in fact, because if you don't, either you don't exist, which is what I suspect, or you do exist and you don't care if I'm damned, in which case you're not benevolent, in which case you're hardly a God at all. Well, God not only answers prayers, He has a sense of humor, because I had a heart attack and was sent to the hospital two days after I prayed that prayer. In the hospital, I had a vision of the Virgin Mary and several other visions, which I'm not at liberty to speak about in any detail. And my heart attack was cured by prayer, and I also had a religious experience about a week later that was different from the original visions, and I was just drenched with a superfluity of evidence, an abundance of evidence. I had been an atheist because I saw no evidence that God existed. Then I saw that there was evidence, so I changed my mind. I had to change my mind upon my integrity as a philosopher.